Good afternoon, everyone. I am Johannes Urpelainen. I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar with Professor Josh Busby from University of Texas, Austin, who is going to tell us about climate leadership and followership in the global system. Full disclosure, I am myself a co-author of this study. So if you hear me praise the study, I have a bit of a self-interest in that. So what we're going to do today is first I'm going to ask Professor Busby to give us a presentation on the topic. And then after that, I'm going to open it for audience questions. You can see there is a Q&A function in the Zoom. Please feel free to ask questions anytime. I will then keep an eye on them. I will moderate the discussion with Professor Busby and possibly weigh in myself every now and then. This session is being recorded, and we will also share the slides with you after the presentation on email with everybody who RSVP'd. So I very much look forward to the discussion, and with that I would like to pass the baton to Professor Busby.
Thank you, Johannes. Thanks for the invitation. Delighted to be with you all. I'm going to call up some slides momentarily and look forward to talking through this paper with you. So the title of the paper is Following the Leaders, How to Restore Progress in Global Climate Governance. And it's the same title as the recent article that Johannes alluded to in Global Environmental Politics that's now available at the link below, open access. And it builds on previous work with Nigel Purvis in a paper that we wrote for the Atlantic Council in 2018. So what I'd like to do with you now is talk about the current trajectory of emissions and emissions reductions, unpack the concepts of leadership and followership, and then speak to how that relates to what should be done going forward. If people well know, global surface temperatures are already more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 2 decades. And if you look at the concentration of greenhouse gases, they're already higher than they've been for 800,000 years. The 2015 Paris Agreement was an attempt to arrest those trends. And it was a bottom-up agreement based on country commitments of national intent. And those country commitments were not legally binding, though other aspects of the agreement were. And it was a real departure from previous efforts like the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, not least of which it was because it had nearly universal commitments by all countries in the international system, including, importantly, from countries like China and India, and it avoided some of the ratification problems that had bedeviled the Kyoto Protocol that had made it hard for countries like the US to fully participate. But it was recognized that it was merely a down payment on what was needed. In itself, the commitments that countries made were not sufficient to avoid dangerous climate change, but the hope was that it would instantiate a virtuous circle and build trust and achievement, and countries could ratchet up their ambition later on with more ambitious commitments over time. And as I just mentioned, that it was only seen as a down payment on what was needed. And if you look at the UNEP has a gap report, and they evaluated the commitments that fully enacted under the Paris Agreement. How far would they go to what was needed to avoid dangerous climate change? And basically their assessment was, if fully implemented, it was about only a third of the way of what was needed to avoid dangerous climate change. And what we've seen over the last few years is that those commitments aren't being fully met. And so not only were the commitments themselves not fully adequate, but the trajectory of emissions continues to go up. And that includes emissions from key countries. China, the US, and India had emissions go up considerably in 2018. And if you look at the trajectory of emissions over time, US emissions have come down considerably since the mid-2000s. Started to tick back up again in the Trump years, before, again, falling a little bit more last year. And we can talk a bit more why that was in Q&A. But the net takeaway is that US emissions have only fallen 12.3% below 2005 levels. And that's not where the US needs to be to meet its commitment, say, under the 2009 Copenhagen Agreement, when it committed to a 17% reduction below 2005 levels by this year. So it's at 12% when it wanted to be at 17%. And it's not on target to meet the commitments that the US made under the Paris Agreement, which was a 26 to 28% emissions reduction by 2025. And so the US isn't on track to meet those goals either. And China, for its part, its commitment under the Paris Agreement was to have its emissions peak on or around 2030. And it still might do that, but expectations were raised that it would do it a lot sooner based on emissions reductions in 2013 and 2014. But since 2015, emissions have been rising and continued to rise last year. And so we don't appear to be on track to meet even the modest commitments that were made in Paris, and the coronavirus has happened, right? And that, on some level, that has allowed for greater emissions reductions, but that itself is not a solution to climate change, not least of which the incredible suffering and economic dislocation that has happened is not a recipe for success over the long run. And the actual emissions reductions that we've seen aren't nearly all that much. The annual estimates for what will happen in this year is maybe globally between 4.2 and 7.5%. And to put that into perspective, the assessments for what's required to avoid dangerous climate change is full decarbonization of the global economy by or around or near 2050. And so that requires emissions reductions like we've seen or in excess of what we've seen on an annual basis with the coronavirus every year for the next 30 or 40 years, but without the incredible dislocation that we've seen during the coronavirus outbreak. And so this speaks to the enormity of the challenge that we have before us to avoid dangerous climate change. And the challenge, politically in this space is that we have plenty of countries that have come forward and expressed an interest in leadership, but it's increasingly European countries that are responsible for a smaller sliver of global emissions, and it isn't enough to generate sufficient followership. We don't have enough followers to generate the kind of action that's required to really address this crisis. And so, what's the relationship between leadership and followership, and how might we generate more followership in the climate space? And that's really what this paper and project speaks to. So in the political science literature, we have a pretty good understanding of kind of different dimensions of leadership. There's power-based leadership, directional leadership, intellectual leadership, instrumental leadership. And then let me talk about each of those in turn and how that relates to followership. So in terms of power-based leadership, some countries, by their material capabilities, by their wealth, income, size of their markets, and this isn't just simply true of countries, we can think about companies that have a large market share, that they either through their wealth have the power to reduce their own emissions or encourage emissions reductions by others. And this is really underscored by countries and actors that are responsible for a significant share of emissions that they themselves have significant power to destroy. Now, there are other forms of leadership, directional leadership. These could be unilateral policies like the Norwegian electric vehicles mandate, or we can think about normative leadership like the Pope's encyclical or former Kiribati President Anote Tong's earnest calls at the United Nations for more support for Pacific Island countries and more aggressive action to address climate change to help those countries avoid a dangerous fate. Beyond this directional leadership, we can think about intellectual leadership, new ideas, countries or actors coming forward with technology innovations like direct air capture, or we can think about policy proposals like Bill McKibben's campaign to encourage divestment from fossil fuels. A last category of leadership we might think of as instrumental leadership, as new networks or coalitions like the Powering Past Coal Alliance or the RE100 initiative to get companies on board with net zero commitments, or the subnational effort like the Under 2 MOU coalition. All of these are different varieties of leadership, but it requires followers to come join them. And not all countries or actors are the same when it comes to followership. And So how can we think through the varieties of followership and how to get the right actors participating in the global climate regime and commitments going forward? Well, we're political scientists and we love typologies, 2x2 typologies, and we've created one here based on two salient characteristics: the actors' capacity to implement policy and the degree of environmental mobilization. And we're mostly focusing on state behavior here. And here, when I say environmental mobilization, I'm thinking about representation in government. And so you can have actors that have high capacity and high mobilization, what we call enthusiasts. You can have actors that have low capacity and low mobilization, what we call hard nuts. And then you can have mixed categories. You can have actors that are have high mobilization, but low capacity, what we call pliables. And then we have the potential for low mobilization, but high capacity, what we call reluctance. Let me talk about each of those in turn and unpack those categories. So the enthusiasts are those, like I suggested, that have high environmental mobilization and representation in government. And they're also highly poised and capable in terms of state capacity to implement policy. And so these countries may be leaders in their own right or early adopters. They're enthusiasts. They may follow with just a bit of information. They may follow others. And we can think of a country like Denmark with its aggressive decarbonization law as being one that is high ambition and high representation of environmental interests in their government, but also the high capacity to implement that policy. We might think of the other category of there is an interest, there's a willingness by a government to implement environmental mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but they may actually have limited or low capacity to implement. And here we might think of Ethiopia as an example, that they came forward with a carbon neutrality target of 2025, and yet they may need some help. They may need technical assistance to be able to meet that objective or one like it. The third category of follower types are what we call reluctance. These are countries that actually have the capacity to implement, but they don't want to, at least under their current leadership. And we can think of the Trump administration as embodying a country that does have high capacity to implement policy, but isn't willing to. And we can also think about Brazil under the current leadership of Bolsonaro being like that, because under previous leadership of the Lula regime in the early 2000s, they dramatically decreased deforestation. Yet under the current leadership, it's soared back. And here the available options are maybe coercion and incentives to try and induce those countries to change their behavior, or you may just have to wait for political change. And that can take a while. The last category of countries that have both low mobilization and low capacity. These are countries maybe like the Democratic Republic of Congo that isn't that interested in environmental protection or emissions mitigation, thinking about deforestation losses, but also has low capacity to implement. So you might need a combination of sort of coercion and incentives to get them on side, but also considerable technical assistance so that they can actually implement policy. The challenge in the wider space is how do you induce a participation cascade? How do you get enough of the world on board participating so that we actually have sufficient ambition to avoid dangerous climate change? And that means the right actors need to be involved, namely the major emitters, those that have significant power to destroy. And the challenge is that in many, at writ large, if we think about the global climate change problem, in its entirety, or if we think about it in terms of specific areas, that there are lots of states that are either reluctance or hard nuts. And so how do we get countries responsible for about 80% of emissions to move forward with ambitious commitments? And this is essentially the problematic that we identify in the paper. So what do we do about it? Well, fortunately, things are changing. In the electricity space, we have some technological changes in the costs of renewables that make it far easier for us to imagine, particularly in the electricity space, to move away from coal and other fossil fuels. So solar electricity has declined in cost by 89% in the last 10 years. We also see falling costs for wind and, importantly, falling costs for batteries, which is going to matter both for battery storage, but also for electric vehicles. And with the falling costs of renewables, we are also seeing the potential for electrification of other sectors. And that's led to increased penetration and aspirations for, say, all electric vehicles. And we're seeing that in the EV mandate from Norway, but also from California and other subnational actors in the US. And so we're seeing electric vehicles starting to break out, right? In Europe, they're now responsible for nearly 10% of new vehicle sales. Now, that's not simply a function of technological changes, it also has to do with policy. We're also seeing, importantly, some big policy changes that have happened even in the last few months. And we have had China step forward with its own carbon neutrality target of a 2060 target, and that was followed quickly by actions by Japan and South Korea. And we now have, with the election of Joe Biden, importantly, commitment from the US to try and depart from the previous administration's policy and join the club of countries that have ambitious climate commitments. And when we look at what that might mean, we have 127 countries that have net zero pledges. And if we include the Biden administration is likely to be among them, that's responsible for around 63% of global emissions. So we're getting there to that sort of participation cascade in terms of mid-century decarbonization goals. But now begins the hard part, because to get to 2060 or 2050 mid-century or thereafter decarbonization, we've got to be reducing emissions dramatically between now and then with short and medium term action. So how do we get there? So in this paper, we talk about 3 different stylized ways of thinking about how to get there through insights from theories of collective action. One of the things that we think about is that the climate change problem looks on some level unmanageable when we're talking about it in the aggregate. There's 190 countries. This is a problem that affects many different sectors. And it's essentially a problem of problems, that there are many different problems. There are problems for the transport sector, the electricity sector, for industry, for buildings, for agriculture, for forests. And trying to deal with them all in the aggregate through, say, one venue like the annual climate negotiations isn't likely to be productive. But if we break it down into smaller, more manageable problems that's sector specific, we think that there are lots of opportunities for progress. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The second thing is, can we focus on the relevant? Which countries and which actors are relevant for emissions mitigation? And maybe in doing so, we can make some breakthroughs. And finally, how do we think about getting out of the dynamic of unproductive, conflictual battles with followers, particularly of the reluctant and hard nut types? Is there a way we can emphasize benefits to them and sort of change the cooperative dynamic? We talk about each of these in turn in a bit more detail. So as I said, if you break down the problem into issue-specific sectors, as we've started to do in shipping and aviation, or with respect to short-lived gases like hydrofluorocarbons, the problem starts to look a bit more tractable. You're reducing the number of relevant players, and we know from kind of collective action theory that large numbers of actors makes it harder to get agreement. Aspects of the problem also might be easier for collective action, because in circumstances where the problem looks to be challenging for a state or actor from the perspective of climate change as a whole, if you look in, say, the aviation or shipping space, it might not be such a difficult problem for them. They may be able to see that their interests are served by it, and they may actually have more capacity to implement in an individual sector. And so a sector-based approach may make some of the capacity challenges a little bit more tractable, and the interest and mobilization pieces less difficult, because you might not have such embedded opposition when you look at it through the lens of a particular sector. When we think about focusing on the relevant, I mentioned before, the problem looks intractable. We're focused on 190 countries that all have to change their behavior. But when you think about it from the emissions mitigation perspective, while all countries are affected by climate change, only a handful of countries are really responsible for a significant share of global emissions. And that includes the US and China, which together are responsible for more than 40% of emissions. So China, 28% right now, US, 15%. If we just look at the top 6, that's already 67% of global emissions if we include the EU, India, Russia, and Japan. And if we include the top 20, we're already getting upwards on 3/4 of global emissions. And in some sectors, in some spaces like steel and cement, the emissions are concentrated still further. So it's, focusing on within individual sectors, not just simply who are the countries that matter, but within individual sectors, which are the actors that matter, both at the country level and in terms of firm-specific behavior. And if we can do that, it may help us reduce the number of actors. It targets the actors that are most important for mitigation. And we might think about sort of mechanisms to induce the right actors being part of the equation. And so some of the conversations that have been out there thus far are talking about the idea of carbon clubs, that you get preferential access to trade if you have robust carbon commitments. This can get a little challenging when we think about implementation, like border tax adjustments that may be a bit both coercive but also hard to implement. But it speaks to how do we focus our attention on the right actors that are relevant for this problem to make it more tractable. So the last kind of piece of this is, what if we think that approaches that are like carbon clubs, where you try to get preferential trade access for those that have aggressive climate commitments, potentially penalizing those that don't. We think that that kind of quasi-coercive approach is problematic. Are there other ways to induce followership, particularly for those hard nut states or those reluctants? And here, we think that emphasizing the benefits to followers is an important way to do that. And I'm singling out India as an example here of a country that may have difficulty following unless you appeal to other things that are important to them. So what are the other things that might be important to a country like India other than climate mitigation itself? Well, one thing is that 21 of the world's 30 cities with the worst air quality are in India. And this is an increasingly salient issue. Right now, what's most salient, though, in the Indian context is the fact that they've had 2 consecutive quarters in the midst of the coronavirus of negative economic growth, and they have large-scale unemployment. And the concerns about employment predated the coronavirus outbreak. And so are there policies that you can pursue that are consistent with India's core objectives that may ultimately deliver co-benefits for the climate? So can you focus on what's important to followers, which might not be the climate, it might be other issues. And we sometimes talk about, let's do actions on climate to produce co-benefits for this other area, whether it be air pollution or economic growth. But that may have the logic backwards. For those countries, what's really important to them is air pollution or economic growth. And can you do policies in those areas that redound to the climate? And I think that may help transform reluctance into enthusiasts if you're able to appeal to them based on issues that they care about and do so in a way that's climate compatible. So those are the kinds of insights that we hope to bring to bear that may influence policy directions going forward. So let me come forward with some concluding thoughts. Will leadership efforts generate followership? So you think about the properties of the leaders that have stepped forward. Do they have adequate capabilities to induce followership? So are they themselves responsible for a large share of emissions? And up until China's emergence with its net zero target, I would have said no, that the European countries that were responsible for less than 10% of global emissions, that they didn't have enough leadership potential on their own, either in terms of their own emissions reductions or their material capability or other leadership attributes to induce followership. Now that China has joined the fray with its own net zero commitment and with changes in US politics, we now may be in a position for some leading countries to have much more leadership potential than we had before. But we also have to evaluate, both at the global level, but in specific sectors, what kinds of followers dominate the sector? Are these pliables mostly within this sectoral space? If they are, then we can maybe deal with that through technical assistance. But if they're reluctance or hard nuts, those are going to be more challenging sectors writ large and more challenging countries to deal with. And so I think we can evaluate in both given issue spaces, kind of the nature of the follower types that are dominant, but also we can do that globally as well. Last thing I'd say is we have a historic opportunity in 2021. China is putting forward their 14th five-year plan. They've kind of already sketched out some of the contours, but some of the rules will become clear in 2021. And if you know and have followed the Chinese context of late, you know that while they have this net zero pledge, they are also building many new coal plants at home and financing many new coal plants abroad. And so there's a disjuncture or mismatch between their aspirations for 2060 and what they are appearing to do between now and then. And so if China is serious about demonstrating global leadership on this, and part of that leadership has to do with what they're able to do internally and what they're able to finance externally, their plans for coal finance will have to change. And so that will be an important test. The other important test is going to be what happens in the US. So we'll have the Biden inauguration in January, and then the US has a lot of work to do to restore its global credibility on the world stage. And part of that is through actions that it undertakes internationally by rejoining the Paris Agreement, which the Biden administration will do in January. But a lot of that has to do with what the Biden administration is able to do domestically to reduce its own emissions, which are still even now quite considerable and not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So how can the Biden administration demonstrate its bona fides? And much of that's still up in the air, depending upon the outcome of the Georgia runoffs in January and whether or not the Democrats have a majority in the Senate to even begin to think about passing legislation, or if the Biden administration will be constrained to pursue solely executive action, much as the Obama administration was before. There are two other important events, I think, coming up in 2021. There's the fall UN meetings, which in recent years have been accompanied by sort of the Secretary General-led climate summit, which I think there'll be increased pressure to increase ambition in the lead up to COP26, the next climate negotiations that will be happening in Scotland that were postponed from last year because of the coronavirus. But now this will be the moment at the tail end of 2021 when countries will come forward, perhaps with renewed ambitious pledges to update their Paris commitments, their so-called nationally determined contributions. And there'll be great expectations for countries to come forward with new commitments. In the meantime, I think there's a lot of opportunity at the sectoral level to make sure that the existing sectoral approaches, say in shipping and aviation, are actually serious ones. But in sectors where those efforts haven't really begun yet, like steel and cement, that there'll be renewed emphasis to look at issue-specific approaches to the problem. And I think that going forward is likely to be much more productive than big global gatherings, because we're now going to be in the implementation phase, both at the national level and at the international level. And then the proof is going to be in what concrete steps countries take to move us quickly forward on a zero carbon, towards a zero carbon economy. And so with that, I'll close and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. That was very, very insightful. So I was going to ask a question myself, but somebody from the audience asked almost the same question. So let's combine this. So we have Ilan Sykes asking about carbon club approaches and border adjustments. So the question is, if the concentration of emissions in specific countries, sectors, and firms would make it easier to implement a less coercive border adjustment because of this concentration and easier implementation. And my follow-up to that was just if you could talk more generally about the border adjustment. Do you see that as sort of something that is up and coming in climate policy, or do you think it's a non-starter?
So I think in the old days, people would have said border tax adjustments are hard to justify because they might not be compatible with WTO rules. But I don't think the WTO is especially relevant anymore, given such large-scale violations of its sort of rules already under the previous or the last 4 years. So I feel like that is less of a barrier. For me, it's the administrative barrier of how do you actually implement this without having such high transaction costs of trying to figure out if, you know, every last product that comes in, how do you do this in a way that's not administratively burdensome? So I think it's on the table as a sort of coercive tool that countries are reluctant to impose because they don't know how to do it. Now, I think the way it can work in a more concrete way is, for example, Brazil has a free trade agreement with the Europeans that they haven't fully concluded, that's subject, I think, to European ratification. And while Brazil is deforesting the Amazon, it's pretty clear that that free trade agreement is a dead letter. And so if and until Brazil gets serious on implementing efforts to reduce deforestation, I feel like that is a credible lever that the Europeans can hold over Brazil and say, we will not move forward with this free trade agreement until you change course. And maybe that will change elite politics within Brazil, either directly on Bolsonaro or his successor. I think there's another way in which this can work is that there's a high sort of leakage of natural gas coming particularly from parts of the US like Texas, where there's rampant flaring and high methane leakage. The Europeans are starting to grow skittish about importing natural gas from the US that has high embedded leakage. And so I think there are credible ways in which those deals, individual deals, will be scuppered unless Texas comes to grips with high methane leakage. And so I think there will be sort of discriminating ways in which these relationships might unfold that are slightly different from kind of a full-on border tax adjustment, but that are kind of deal specific and bilateral. And I think that is a way that this can be done that falls short of border tax adjustments, which I haven't seen anything written that suggests this can be done in a way that isn't just an administrative nightmare or ways it can be gamed.
That's great. One thing I'll note here is that there's been quite a bit of research actually on conditionalities related to trade agreements before. And one of the sort of somewhat unfortunate conclusions is that sometimes countries comply with those provisions as long as they're not members. And as soon as they get in, they start backsliding. So you would want to think about how to make them difficult to reverse after they actually sign and ratify the agreements. So we do have more questions from the audience. So next we have Ilmi Granov is asking about the possible change in the politics of leader-follower coalitions if the focus is on sectoral level cooperation instead of economy-wide mitigation. So for example, steel, electric vehicles, or aviation.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and one I want to ponder a bit more. One of the challenges is to think through, like in issues like steel, you have increased the concentrated production in countries like China. And so that helps concentrate the mines, but there are still residual steel producers in other countries. And so I did a webinar earlier this week on what's the scope for, say, US-China collaboration. And we're in an increasingly competitive environment where economic nationalism is surfacing between the two countries. And so it's harder to imagine the kinds of technical cooperation that we might have seen, say, in the Obama administration can happen. And so, I think what we're more likely to see is coordinated efforts where there might be a steel-specific gathering where there's some sharing of best practices, but there's also efforts to kind of hide intellectual property so that some countries don't feel disadvantaged by what others are doing. So in the old days, we might have thought that there'd be greater willingness to share technological innovations across borders to allow them to diffuse. There might be more challenges of operating in that same vein as before, because countries think that if our companies invent this stuff, we're going to make more money from it, and that will enhance our own national competitiveness. And so it's a little less clear to me, given the sort of zeitgeist of US-China tension, how this plays out. I think we're increasingly more likely to have, there's the Chinese diplomat had a piece in the New York Times this week about competitive cooperation, that we're, or what do you call it, co-opetition, where there's which may be healthy. Instead of having a race to the bottom, we have a race to the top, where countries are trying to outcompete each other in being better when it comes to carbon neutrality. So, and part of that's both about reducing their own emissions, but also finding markets externally for these low carbon, zero carbon technologies. And so I think that scrambles the coalition-based approach somewhat in ways that I think, we need a follow-on piece to fully reckon with at the specific sectoral level. But my initial implication, I think there's still some technical cooperation possibilities when you think about US-India collaboration, that those kinds of, Arunabha Ghosh, for example, had a piece last week that proposed US-India bilateral cooperation on battery storage. And he had a similar one a few years ago. Actually, he had the one on battery storage was from a few years ago. He had a new one that was on, say, direct air capture. And I feel like those are those kinds of coalitional opportunities that we're going to try to have to seize. But it's going to be very, very targeted in very practical and specific ways.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Next, I have Nicholas John is asking about finance contributions. So for example, if countries make contributions to the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility, is that itself an indicator of leadership? If it's, let's say, it's focused on adaptation?
Yeah, on some level it is. And so then we think through the practicalities of how that comes about. I think the expectations, for example, for the US are to do more in that space. And as we know, the US made a pledge of $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund, which wasn't all that much. And then the Obama administration was only able to have Congress appropriate $1 billion of that. And so if there are great expectations for leadership from the US, and part of that leadership expectation is both finance for mitigation and also finance for adaptation, the US is in a difficult position if the Biden administration doesn't get 50 votes in the Senate. Like, it will have trouble appropriating from Congress many or any money for those purposes. And so then the US has to think about the billionaires, that are important ones like Bezos, who've come forward with their own individual personal commitments and have, he basically just doled out $761 million recently to a number of environmental groups. So we could imagine that there might be efforts to crowdsource private finance to complement public money. And that's an uncomfortable position to be in, but that happened before when Ted Turner financed US's back dues to the United Nations. But we now have super empowered billionaires who actually have a lot more resources to contribute to that. We had some modest pledges, I think, in 2015 with calls for mission innovation on the technology innovation front. And so Gates and others have contributed to that. But I don't think we've had commensurate contributions from rich individuals on the adaptation front. And I think that would be an area where there may be efforts where a Biden administration could even get Republican support, thinking about specific initiatives for, say, low-lying island countries or African countries that are vulnerable to climate change, that if we're just focused on adaptation, that there may be a way to do a PEPFAR-like program, thinking about the AIDS initiative that the Bush administration was able to pass. If you're able to cultivate bipartisan ties on specific pieces of this that don't look like just giving, a lot of money to some multilateral organization to do climate change stuff, if you're able to do maybe bilateral and multilateral contributions for specific purposes that look like they're compatible with, interest that the U.S. has in, say, the Pacific with military bases and other normative sense of obligation that low-lying island countries through no fault of their own are very vulnerable. I think those could be ways to unlock this issue that are more productive than just trying to get $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Next comes my favorite question from Gabriel Weil so countries like India obviously know that they have air quality problems and that they understand the public health benefits of reducing them. So is there anything that the global community can do to kind of encourage or incentivize those ways of reducing air pollution that actually also contribute to decarbonization? Because after all, we do know that you can also just put scrubbers on those coal-fired power plants. So do you have any thoughts on how to engage in things like this?
Well, some of that is, can be technical assistance through the national labs, where there are pieces of this problem like, seasonal burning of agricultural stubble, where we have some technological initiatives like low-till methods or no-till methods, where you dig in some of that agricultural stubble and change the approach from burning agricultural waste to digging it in. Those are maybe things that India has some awareness of, but isn't fully, it hasn't fully bought into. And maybe it needs some external support because the equipment needed for that is quite expensive. And so that may be ways in which that simultaneously helps India think through like the modalities for dealing with its air pollution problem that also redound to climate, but also puts pressure on India, because I think it raises an interesting question about whether or not international awareness of India's air pollution problem creates more pressure on Indian elites to deal with it, that it empowers the people who care about it domestically to do more. And it's a little less clear given India's sort of hostile climate for NGO activity, particularly NGO activity that's financed by international actors, that the advocacy side of it may be less likely to have successful inroads given the current climate in India. But the technical cooperation component, I still think could be a winner and serve the same function of putting pressure on Indian elites to say, look, why is it that, people in Delhi are, equivalently smoking like 30 cigarettes a day, or, 5 years of their life expectancy are being cut off because they are living under such terrible air quality. So I think that's an avenue for collaboration, but I certainly would like to write more on it because I think that's the focus kind of activity that we need to help India see what a low carbon future would look like. And that is also going to require other things like dealing with, integration of variable renewable power into their electric grid. That's another conversation.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Josh. Certainly a very difficult challenge. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting research coming out on that. Next, I have my colleague Douglas Hengel is asking about the role of financial regulators. So, do you think this kind of increased scrutiny of investments and finances and assets and funds on climate change risks, could that push companies and countries to move faster?
I think it's complementary. I think you definitely need, and there have been talk of enhancing the disclosure standards for the SEC and other places. I think that's starting to happen, and I think that's useful. The other approaches that I think are complementary would be, there have been new multilateral finance guidelines on finance for coal. Most multilateral lending institutions have announced new policies that say we will not lend to coal. And that hasn't happened fully in, say, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or by Chinese domestic, companies or entities. And I think, if there's an area, for example, for US-China cooperation, it would be, will the Chinese entities join the rest of the world in harmonizing standards to basically zero out support for coal finance? And so I think that then will redound on market actors more. And that's the kind of productive way forward. I think the complementary approaches are, governments asking private companies and investors to disclose what their carbon liabilities are likely to be, but maybe that's it's less clear to me that how important that on its own is, other than the fact that we're seeing a lot of movement to private sector low carbon firms. The market capitalization of companies like Exxon appears to be on the wane.
So let me follow up on that and ask a kind of related question. So what about public finance? So we live in a kind of time of very low interest rates. So some people have made the argument that shouldn't the government just take loans and invest in low carbon infrastructure and kind of solve this problem by doing that? So what do you think of that argument?
Well, I think infrastructure investments are really going to be important for the EV transition, for example. We're not going to get, right now I've got an electric vehicle, but I can't depend on intercity travel, even to say College Station where Texas A&M is, because you can't get reliable fast charge. My wife made the drive and spent most of the day just trying to find a charger so that she could get back to Austin. We have an electric vehicle that still has 200-mile range. So until you have, government support and investment in that electric vehicle infrastructure throughout the country, like we invested in the interstate highway system in the Eisenhower era, until we have that, we're not going to have the kind of EV take-up that's required to have, robust electrification of the transport sector. And so I think, that's the kind of investment that countries like the US are going to have to pursue to make it feasible for people to embrace the low carbon options in electric vehicles. And I think we can think along those lines of what would be required to do that in other sectors. I mean, even in the transport space, there are other things like mass transit that until we deal with the coronavirus successfully, I saw that the DC Metro may be scuppering or closing. They won't run on the weekends, that they'll only come every 30 minutes. Basically some of the low carbon options that we have for mass transit have been dramatically hurt by the coronavirus outbreak. And a lot of public investment is going to be required to make sure that those services are able to survive the current moment, but then the coronavirus approach itself is going to make it possible for people to have public confidence in mass transit again.
Got it. So one of the, I guess, frustrating things about this recovery from COVID-19 or the government effort so far is that we haven't really seen a lot of green stimulus. So we are tracking those stimulus bills across the group of 20. And really the only two countries that have made a serious effort are the European Union and South Korea. I think everybody else is at best neutral, and in many cases, including the United States, is very badly biased in favor of fossil fuels. So it's a kind of a opportunity that may have been lost, at least for now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But there's still much stimulus that's needed in the U.S. context, for example. And so there's lots of opportunity. And then you just have to think about what are the kinds of shovel-ready projects that are compatible with climate goals. And some of that might be, buildings insulation type work and procurement for government facilities and government vehicles, and there are ways in which the government can be a leader in that. And we just have to think systematically and concretely which are the areas where we think that's most likely to be productive, but also be willing to take some risks, and some things won't work out.
That's right. That's right. One does hope that the lesson from 2008, 2009 wasn't that Solyndra went bankrupt, right? Because in the end, the overall performance of that R&D and demonstration and pilot program is actually pretty good, right? So most of those companies produce very good returns in the end. So let's hope that once we get the Biden administration, we take a sort of a smart and a sophisticated approach to how to get this right.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Indeed, indeed. So we still have a few minutes if there are any other questions from the audience. I think I've cleared the queue for now, but are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, so if there are no more questions, thanks first of all, Josh, for taking the time to give us this presentation, very timely and insightful. Thanks to the audience for attending, really good questions, good discussion. Do check out the piece. Maybe we'll send the link to everybody after the presentation. It's open access till the end of the year, right? So people will be able to read the academic piece, and you will also have the recording of this session, so you can go back and take a look at the greatest hits today. So thanks everybody again. Do follow our work on our website, size-isep.org. We will be having more webinars after the winter holiday on topics like this. So look forward to seeing you again. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.